الو سایه‌کست. All right, Douglas.
Hey.
Welcome.
Bayani Bash, Bani-san.
So I'm going to start off like very simple, but I want to get to know you a bit more actually. Basically here, obviously, we know what a doctor does,
Sure.
what a lawyer does,
Sure.
what an engineer does.
Yes.
So when you go to their office, you know what to expect.
Yeah.
But what do we get when we go into an embassy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, so let me back up. When I first became a diplomat 15 years ago, every American diplomat goes through this sort of boot camp training course where you learn about the basics of diplomacy and how to be a diplomat. And the interesting thing was, every time we would ask a question, the answer was 100% of the time, it depends. And so it really depends a great deal on the specific portfolio they have, the country you're in, what's happening geopolitically at the time. And then also based on other things that I'll explain right now that are hard to put into small words. The Department of State, which is what we call our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have a Secretary of State who's basically your equivalent to your Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then they have, several layers of people underneath them in the bureaucracy. And then you get to where I'm at, which is like the working level. So at the working level, if you look at what we call foreign service officers, which is our overly long and complicated way of saying diplomat, there's sort of 5 different flavors. There are political officers, and they are very similar to our economic officers. Both of them, their job is sort of half journalist and half lobbyist. So in part, they're going out and they're meeting with their contacts. For the political officers, that's typically people in political parties in the government. For economic officers, that's typically for people either in the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury Department, and then also people in the business community. And they're writing essentially newspaper stories, but directed just back to our government in Washington. And we do have this thing called the Freedom of Information Act. So for the most part, if you're really interested, you can file what we call a FOIA request and see the kinds of reports that they're putting, as long as they're not classified. And then the other part of their job is lobbying. So of course we have policy interests. We have things that we think would be better for France to do, for Germany to do, for Iraq to do, for the Kurdistan region to do. And so in those cases, we're going to go and talk with the business community or with the government community and say, hey, we think this is a good idea. We think, for example, this would be a terrible policy. This is not so good for your economy. This is not so good for human rights, whatever it is. Or if it's an economic thing, hey, please buy United States stuff and not some other country's stuff. It might be lobbying for that purpose. So they sort of served a dual role in that sense of reporting and also lobbying. The one that most people who are not American are going to encounter if they visit an embassy or a consulate is our consular section. That's the third out of our 5 sort of flavors of diplomat. So they would be going in to get a visa to the United States. If they're an American, they might be going in to get a lost passport. If they've lost a passport, if they've been arrested or if they're hospitalized, we can provide certain services to them. We cannot just get Americans out of jail. Every American is subject to the local laws of the country that they're in. So, but we can make sure that they're treated fairly in the justice system, that they have access to lawyers. If an American, loses all of their money, we can help them find a way to get back to the United States. So those types of things for the consular sections. That's 3 out of 5. The 4th one I'll talk about is management. So they essentially build the platform that everyone else uses to do their jobs. So they make sure that we get our salaries. They make sure we have desks and chairs and computers, working toilets and good office spaces with air conditioning and lights. They do a lot hiring and firing for the entire consulate and the embassy community. So without them, we really couldn't survive and do any of our jobs. They're really crucial to everything that we do, but they're sort of the unsung heroes of the diplomatic community. And the last one, that's the one that I do, is called public diplomacy. And that means just as little to Americans as it does to anyone else. No one has any idea what that means because we do everything else. So we do the engagements with the media. We do engagements on social media. We run our social media platforms. We do education programs, English programs, cultural programs, exchange programs, outreach programs. Typically, if you're seeing an American speak at a university or a community center, or if you see a notice about our exchange programs for either professionals or academics, that's going to be run by our public diplomacy section. So that's the 5 main flavors of the traditional diplomats. We also have what are called specialists. So these are people who need very specific training and skills to do their job effectively. So our office managers, the people who make sure that we get all the paper back and forth between the different sections. We have our security specialists. We have our IT specialists.
Right.
They're also diplomats, but they sort of serve a different role because they do need a specialized training that the rest of us don't need. On top of that, every single embassy and consulate has a huge, typically the vast majority of people working at an embassy or a consulate are actually hired locally.
Locally meaning?
From that country.
Right.
So here, I don't know, 70, 80, 90%, I don't even know, of the people at the consulate are actually Kurds.
Right.
And they are the people who provide the long-term memory for the consulate. So here in Iraq, and this varies around the world, most Americans only stay 1 year. So it's really hard to develop the kinds of relationships that you need to be effective and do your job without the local staff helping fill in those gaps. So, when an American leaves, they get some handover notes from their predecessor, or they give their handover notes to their future person, but that's not going to answer 99% of the questions that they need to be effective. So it's the local staff who are really introducing them to the people that they need to know and helping them understand the local context so that they can be effective in their jobs.
And why is it that they, I don't know if you're also, but why is it that you stay for only a year?
So different countries do it differently. Okay. Some countries have a model where they stay 5 years or 4 years or 3 years. What we typically do in the Department of State is for countries that are at a comparable level of development and safety as the United States, it's usually a 3-year tour. For countries where either the level of development is significantly lower or there's a slightly elevated risk or danger level, it's 2 years. And then where we feel that there's a larger security threat, it's typically 1 year. Now here, realistically, that's because we're within the federal, Iraq, and so there's certainly a different security profile down in Baghdad than there is up here.
But here in Erbil.
Exactly. Yeah. But we're choosing as a security thing to just treat this as one sort of territory for those planning purposes. So right now, all of the jobs in Iraq are posted for 1 year. But what I am noticing is that more and more people serving at the consulate are choosing to stay 2 years because they see it as a great place to work. They see it as a place where they can get their jobs done effectively and be effective and make meaningful change. So I, for example, am staying here for 2 years.
Wow.
And then this is on top of, I actually served here for a year and a half, about 5 years ago, fell in love with the region. Many of our staff are choosing to stay for 2 years in the Kurdistan region in particular, because we see this as just a great place to be and a place where we can make a meaningful difference. Yeah.
So when you get the job, you get the job. It doesn't change based on who you have, what political parties in government, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
99% that's the case. So if a president comes in, the president, he or she might have different policy priorities. So they might say, okay, my policy right now is really to focus on China. So I would like to see more people working on the China portfolio. And so they might move some positions around from a portfolio that the president de-emphasizes or deprioritizes to one that the president is very concerned about. Typically, though, that's much easier domestically in Washington than it's going to be at the embassies abroad. The embassies abroad, it takes years to change the staffing levels.
Wow.
So, that's typically not something that a president can change overnight. But domestically, it's easier to sort of shift portfolios around.
Okay. So who were you before you started working as a diplomat?
Great question. So I graduated from college in 2001.
Where?
In California. It's a small school. You've never heard of it, called Pomona College, but it was a great place. I had an amazing time there.
Right. What did you study? Sorry?
Yeah, I started as a physics major, gave up on that, became a French literature major, gave up on that, and then I finally ended up with environmental studies.
Oh, wow.
Largely unrelated to most of what I do as a diplomat, but it's becoming more important now.
Yes.
I think the Biden administration is certainly, I think I can say safely, a very different approach to climate issues than the Trump administration did. There's more of an emphasis on it. We're spending more of our staff resources, more of our money trying to figure out solutions to the climate emergency.
Right.
And so it is becoming more of what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes. I will ask you more about that actually, but this is a concept that people here don't understand, the fact that you can actually change your mind when you study. You don't have to stick to that first.
Yeah, so that's one thing that's great about the U.S. university system. Typically, students are not expected to determine what they're going to study until the end of their second year or the beginning of their third year.
Oh, that's so clever.
In our four-year system. So I know different universities. I think the Schengen zone mostly has 3-year universities for bachelors. We have a 4-year system for bachelors for the undergraduate degree. So usually it's about halfway through that you pick what you actually want to major in. Some people come in knowing what they want to do, but typically an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old is not going to know what they want to do. I certainly didn't know.
Exactly.
And so I went in, and you have a chance to take a variety of courses in different fields and sort of get a sense of what you genuinely enjoy. We have a model that's a little bit different than the European model called a liberal arts framework for education. And so the idea for us, it's sort of a very philosophical idea that we should be producing well-rounded citizens, not just specialists in physics or painting or French lit, but people who have a little bit of knowledge about many different things. So not just people who can contribute effectively to the economy, but also people who are going to be good citizens in a democracy, people who can think critically about the different various issues of the day as they arise and be informed voters when they go to the voting booth. Exactly. As we say, your mileage may vary, so the results may vary based on that. Some people get more out of that system than others. I think it's a great system overall, but certainly if you know at 18 that you want to be, a mechanical engineer, maybe the European system is better for you in that sense. Basically, you can get in and get out in 3 years and move on with your life. But for most American teenagers, I would say, they're not that clear about what they want to do. So I think in that case, the liberal arts system is probably a better fit.
You can also do something called gap year.
Yes, absolutely. That's really rare in the United States.
Yeah, it's more common in Europe.
Britain and Europe, exactly.
Yeah.
I think there's two things. One is I think parents are afraid that their children will not return to university if they realize how fun the real world can be.
Yeah, exactly.
So if they finish studying and then they go out and they, have a great year traveling around learning about the world, that they wouldn't be as motivated to go back to university. And
gap year could also be working somewhere.
They could absolutely do that too. And then they might, and that might work for them. Maybe it's a great option. It's one that Americans really haven't explored.
Yeah.
I think there's advantages and disadvantages. So I think there's the parental fear. And in the United States, because university is paid, it's not provided for free like it is in most places in Europe.
Yeah.
It's typically a big financial investment on the part of either the parents or the student who takes loans to be able to afford their university. Exactly. So there's that fear. And then there's also just the sort of fact that everyone else is doing it. Most of your friends from university or from high school, are going to university, and there's an entire social structure set up in high schools to support people who are looking at colleges and making those decisions and trying to figure out what they're going to do with the next few years of their life. And I certainly don't want to say that all high school students in the United States go to university. That's not the case. And for many people, it's not the right choice, that they would be better served just going directly into work or into a vocational educational setting to learn a trade.
Not everyone can afford it.
Exactly. Not everyone can afford it. So there's a lot of reasons that someone might legitimately choose not to go to university in the United States. And for some people, that's the best decision for them. But there is certainly a lot of support in high schools from what we call guidance counselors who literally are there to help you figure out either your career or your college choices, your parents, your friends. Everything is set up to make the decision to go to university easy if that's what you choose to do. Exactly. And then doing that without that support system during a gap year might be intimidating for some people. So we don't have that cultural tradition, and so it's just not something that most people choose to do. So I did sort of the opposite. I waited until I was done with university, and then I did essentially a gap year after that. So I went to India, and I backpacked around the country, and it was amazing and just a very different experience.
Just to explain what backpacking is.
Yeah, so...
It's also not traditional here.
Oh, interesting, yeah. So I literally took what I needed to survive on a day-to-day basis in a backpack, a very big backpack, and I flew to India, and I had a 1-year round-trip ticket, so I knew I would be there for a year, but I didn't know where I'd be going or what I'd be doing.
Just decided in the moment.
It had been really fascinating to me. I had actually been studying yoga in college.
Of course you have.
Exactly. I was in California, which is very famous for being sort of hippie and granola and yoga.
Yeah.
And so I was really fascinated by India. I wanted to go learn more about the history of yoga and how people were doing it there. So I found this book that was different yoga. It just listed different yoga teachers across India, and I traveled around and did yoga in different places. Took the trains, ate the local food, stayed in $1 a night hostels and hotels. So it's very inexpensive, particularly at that time, to travel around India. And I was able to do that on a very small budget. After that, while I was in India, I met so many people from Europe and Australia and New Zealand and Israel and other places that I ended up traveling for another year, mostly just visiting those people and what we say couch surfing, so staying on people's couches for free for another year, just with all the people that I'd met, all the friends that I'd made. After that, I was well and truly broke, so I had to go back to the United States to start working again. Moved back to California. I got a job at a children's museum, which is maybe also not a concept that's very familiar in Iraq or the Iraqi Kurdistan region, but instead of just a museum where everything is behind glass and with little text information, and you go and you say, ooh, look at this piece of artwork that's so old, and you fall asleep in half an hour. We have this concept called children's museums where it's devoted to learning through play. So you can touch everything, and it's designed for children to be able to learn. So I managed the gardens, for example. So they could go into a burrito garden where they could see and touch and smell corn and tomato and onion and garlic plants and bean plants and see, where does this food come from? Right. We had a giant human-size ant hill where children could climb through the ant colony and learn how ants actually created their tunnels and what they looked like inside. So different sort of activities like that were focused on play, but also for learning. So I worked there for several years. I really missed traveling, though, and as in most countries, maybe not Norway, but unfortunately in most countries, teachers are not very well paid.
Also in Norway.
Okay, fair enough. I think in Finland they get very good wages.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Maybe that's the rare exception. Yeah. So in the United States, teachers and people working in education do not end up getting what I think fairly paid.
Yeah.
And so I really just had enough money to survive. I loved my job, but I missed travel. And so I was looking for opportunities to travel. So I ended up moving to the south of France, where I got a job as an English teacher. And then in that sort of period of travel, I met some people who were thinking about working for the U.S. government abroad, either as diplomats or as people in USAID, which is our International Development Agency. And it sounded fascinating, so I took the test to become a diplomat, which I can tell you more about if you want to hear about it.
Yes, please.
I passed, but with a barely passing score. It was just enough to get me on the list of people who were eligible, but realistically, there were so many people on that eligible list, I probably wasn't going to get a job offer. So one way to improve your score is with a foreign language. I had already studied Russian in high school and college, and so I moved to Moscow for a year, where I studied Russian and also taught English to survive. And at the end of that year, I was able to test with Russian to get the bonus points, and then immediately got a job offer with the Department of State, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Wow.
I came in with Russian points, and so they really should have sent me somewhere that speaks Russian, but instead they sent me to Bangladesh,
Of course.
which is very logical, as the State Department tends to be, very logical with their placement decisions.
Yes. Did they know you had traveled in India or something? Or
Yeah, they did. Maybe. Who knows?
maybe they're like, you're close.
It's possible.
Yeah.
I have no idea. It's your first 2 jobs with the State Department. You don't get much of a choice about where you go. I remember I gave them a list of 100 different cities around the world in order of priority, and they chose something from it. So they try really hard to give you something in your top half of 100. So your top 50 is what they're going for. They try to give everyone something in their top half. And most people, they succeed for that. But
God, what a huge amount of work.
it is a lot of work. But, you might get 40 or 45 on your top 100. So you don't have a lot of choice your first 2 jobs.
Okay.
After that, it's really more up to you to do job interviews like anyone would do for any other job. And you have to convince the hiring manager in that city that you're the best candidate. And so, I've worked in Bangladesh, Ukraine, Egypt, here in Erbil. I went back to Washington to work for a couple of years, Czech Republic in Prague, and then back here. And also in there somewhere, they paid for me to go back to California to do a master's program. So that's been my career in. So it's hard to explain, much like everything in the State Department. Okay. Until the 1970s, there was a field, and it still exists to this day, but just military history. And military history, as understood until the 1970s, was studying generals and how they won or lost wars. In the 1970s, there was a new academic field that came out of that called New Military History, very creative. And instead of looking at generals, it looked at the sort of people fighting on the ground. And what did they do? What decisions did they take that helped anyone win or lose wars? In the
moment, or like planned decisions?
Both. But instead of looking at the top down, it was looking at the bottom up.
Yeah.
So a different perspective on the same questions. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a third field that developed in military history called War and Society. And that's essentially throwing out the question of why did a war get won or lost, and looking at the impacts of war on a society. So what happens to the families left behind? What happens to the soldiers when they come back with post-traumatic stress disorder? What's happening in different elements of government, what's happening in the Ministry of Economy during a war? What's happening to a protest movement in a society, an anti-war movement? Every other question about conflict, except for why did we win or lose, that's fair game for this field called War and Society. And so that was actually my major in my master's program.
Right. Do you also have like effects on societies that have experienced like imperialism and the self-hatred that actually, let's say, colonies or
absolutely
experience?
Those are all fair game questions for this field. It's so broad that almost anything fits as long as there's conflict somewhere in the story. One fascinating book that I read that I would never have read otherwise, and honestly does nothing to help me in any capacity, but I just find it intellectually fascinating. It was a book about, I'm going to mistake the country. I want to say Guatemala, but it was a Central American country that went through a civil war in the 1980s, which was most of the Central American countries. That's why I'm having a hard time placing it. The book went 20 years later after the war, and it interviewed women who had been recruited into the war effort.
Oh, yeah.
And it was asking them questions, how did you get recruited? Who came and recruited you? Why did they recruit you and not some other woman? How did your job responsibilities change during the Civil War? And did the skills that you had before the war impact what you ended up doing during the war? So it's just fascinating questions.
Wow.
And then, what happened to you after? Did you end up going back and being a homemaker? Did you get a job? Did you end up in government? What happened to you after the war? And was there some sort of explanatory factor? Could they look at, was there a relationship between what you were doing, what assignments you were giving in the war, and what happened to you after the war? It's just a fascinating book.
Do you remember the name of the book?
Oh, I'd have to Google it and get back to you. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, when it comes to the climate change and the crisis, I mean, obviously, you know way more than me.
Oh, probably not. Probably not. You probably know more than me.
No, I mean, I know the basic stuff that is like focused on how I can change my everyday life to participate. But like people here probably have heard about it.
Yeah.
Many people in the world don't actually believe in it.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah. But I can like very shortly sum up the stuff that I know that we would love the viewers and listeners to learn a bit more about. But for instance, I mean, the first thing I remember learning at school was about the ozone layer.
Yes.
How it was like meant to protect us, or like sort of filter the sunbeam, I guess. And now, because of all the chemicals that has been sort of released, if I can call it, the emissions, anything, the past actually 170 years.
Yeah.
The ozone layer is getting destroyed. So because of that, like skin cancer has increased. Yeah. So you need to use sunscreen.
Definitely.
It's anything from like the type of clothing we use, whether it contains a lot of plastic or not.
Absolutely.
And then UN has come up with
the sustainability
goals.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
And what we have seen is actually, even though let's say developing countries, like unless they still live with nature, I'm thinking about like villagers, etc. Most of the time, especially cities that have adapted Western ways of living, they don't live that environmental friendly, but it's because they can't afford it.
Sure.
Despite that, we have seen that actually most of the climate change problem has roots in Western countries.
Yep, absolutely.
But also China, or like industrial, can I call it industrial? Like
industrialized, sure.
Yeah. And like, for instance, like business owners, Western businesses that go to third world countries, and they have factories that create horrible health conditions for the workers. They do child labor. Businesses that go to any nation and not only take advantage of the natural resources, but actually destroy the natural resources, like the rainforests and reducing the amount of trees.
Absolutely.
I mean, these are like the basic stuff I'm talking about. There's way more science behind it, but you know, it's about like, how do you pick the product? Who do you fund or like finance? And for instance, a local farmer is way better to buy products from and financially support than a big corporate, whether it's in your country or outside your country. So, like I said, there's more. We actually have a series from on 9642 that talks about it in detail.
Cool.
But what is the U.S. doing when it comes to like regulating their business owners?
Sure. Great question. And it's a very complicated answer. You've just brought up, really, you've just identified, 78 different problems that all intersect. And so I think the first thing I would start with is it's completely reasonable and almost expected for each individual person to feel frustrated, because this is not a problem that individuals can solve through their own behavior. You can't just choose to buy recycled plastic and have climate change go away.
Exactly.
You can't just choose to buy organic food at the grocery store and have climate change go away. This is a collective action problem. We've really got to do better about getting the major governments of the world on board to make the kinds of changes that we need to reduce the worst impacts of global warming over time. We have failed at that collectively as a species. In terms of stopping any climate change. There's going to be warming. There's already been warming. And we're already seeing some impacts. And unfortunately, as you pointed out, in a sense of climate justice, it's the richer countries in the world that have been driving the problem of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's the poorer countries of the world that are paying the price. You see Pacific Island nations who are worried about even having a country in 20 years because of sea level rise, might just get rid of the country. Low-lying countries like Bangladesh are experiencing more and more flooding each year as they already grapple with major problems of population density. You know, they have so many people in such a small space. They can't afford to lose any land. With the increase in heat in the atmosphere, we're seeing more and stronger hurricanes and tropical storms. And it's the poor countries that don't even have the resources to rebuild after these storms that are going to be most effective. So there's certainly a climate justice issue that is a moral and ethical question that we have to address. The ozone layer is actually a good example of where collective action went right. So in the 1980s, scientists pointed out that these chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which were not a huge part of the economy, were having an overwhelmingly negative impact on the ozone layer and creating a huge hole at the South Pole. In the 1980s, our President Reagan in the United States worked to ban them not only domestically, but around the world.
Wow.
And that did dramatically reduce the size of the ozone layer hole. You know, we've seen media reports that the size of the hole does fluctuate year to year. Many of those media reports point to China as the source of these CFCs. But it seems to be at least a manageable problem. The currently not managed problem is greenhouse gases, mostly oil. So, you know, Iraq plays a role in that as a major oil exporter. But
Norway.
Norway as a major oil exporter as well. But certainly you can't avoid placing the blame on the Western industrialized country who are buying and burning the oil. You know, most of the media reports I've seen say that something like 50% of overall warming so far has been due to United States burning of oil. So that's certainly something that we have to address domestically, but we're also working on addressing that abroad. The problem is that even if the United States took unilateral action and just stopped burning any oil today, it wouldn't change the overall trajectory of warming because of other countries around the world that are still burning large amounts of oil.
Yes.
So places like Iraq, what are we doing? It's totally unfair to ask Iraq just to stop exporting oil when Iraq is 90-something% of its economy. We can't have Iraq just economically collapse to stop global warming. So what we've been doing is been working with the government and with industry and universities to try to help redirect the Iraqi and the Iraqi Kurdish economy towards different sectors so that hopefully in 20 or 30 years, the Iraqi economy would no longer be dependent on oil.
Like what sector?
So, for example, we're working with organizations like the Taqween Accelerator, with 51 Labs, with other organizations to help create a new class of entrepreneurs who are going to be creating the businesses of the future for this region. We're working with the Ministry of Agriculture and with farmers on climate-smart agriculture to help them use less water, to help them develop different strains of plants that can withstand higher heat.
I heard about this project where people are growing plants in water.
Oh, hydroponics, exactly, yes.
Okay, are you?
You know, if we're doing that here, I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
But we do, for example, there's a partnership between the University of DeHook and Purdue University in Indiana, where they're working on developing different strains of plants that can withstand higher heat levels.
Without that much water.
Exactly, with less water and just more tolerant to heat, so that the Kurdistan region, which has always been the breadbasket of this country, can continue producing the same levels of food or more food in the years to come, even as the climate does change. You know, working with the government on building transparency, building an actually effective banking system, all of which are going to be required for developing that economy that's no longer dependent on oil, which has been tough.
Yes.
But, you know, we're pushing forward on it. We're doing what we can to help encourage that sector. Ultimately, though, this is a sovereign country and a sovereign autonomous region within a larger sovereign country. The KRG and the government of Iraq are going to have to make those choices. We can provide advice, we can provide encouragement, we can provide assistance, we can provide technical knowledge. To some extent, we can provide funding. But at the end of the day, it's the leaders in both of those governments who have to make the right choices to get Iraq and the Kurdistan region on the right path for the climate future.
So desertification has been a major problem here, especially southern Iraq.
Yep.
And we've seen people having to move from their homes because of it.
Yeah.
And actually climate activists and scientists have predicted a huge wave of climate refugees. So how serious do you, like, whether it's professionally or personally, do you believe it's going to be? Like, because it's sort of actually already started.
Absolutely already
But
starting.
is the U.S. prepared for something, or?
I'm not sure that any country in the world is as prepared as they need to be for the reality of climate refugees. I don't think that we're assessing Iraq as a major source country for that at this time. I think most of the discussions I've seen have been really with the South Pacific Islands, with low-lying countries like Bangladesh. Those are the ones that are going to see short-term changes to their coastlines or the loss of their entire country, according to scientists. Iraq is going to get hotter, it's going to get drier, and that is going to lead to people moving to different places. Within the Iraqi context, it might just be different parts of Iraq. You already have huge parts of Iraq that are essentially not populated because they're too hot. So the southwest of the country there's very few people living there. Most of the people in Iraq are living along the two rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, and then within the Kurdistan region, which tends to be more moderate. So the climate refugee issue, honestly, we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it from Iraq as a source country, but we're definitely thinking about it as a government for other countries where sea level rise is going to be a big motivator of change.
And is it like how to help them if they end up in the U.S., or is it help them locate other places, or?
So right now, the International Organization of Migration and UN High Commissioner for Refugees are the major organizations that do the processing, asylees and refugees.
Right.
I don't see that changing in the near future just because we might have different source countries or reasons. Okay. They're probably still the most competent organizations that are able to handle this crisis as it unfolds. The United States does accept a huge number of asylees and refugees every year that are referred to us by the IOM and UNHCR. But I haven't heard any discussion about radically reorganizing how those decisions are made.
Okay. You talked about earlier how American education, and I feel like Norwegian education as well. I used to actually be a teacher back in Norway.
Yeah.
Focus heavily on how to make young people an important part of democracy and also developing societies.
Absolutely.
I believe that there are young people here who wish to do it, and then there are young people who are very focused on like survival, getting a job that they know can financially support them.
Right.
But are there educations in Kurdistan or in Iraq where they can take part in like helping fixing the environment in any way?
So
that you know of.
At the K through 12 level, so the Ministry of Education level, I can't speak to that. I don't know the system well enough.
Okay.
I haven't heard about anything. Maybe at the private schools they have more of those opportunities than at the public schools.
Right.
I'm not sure. At the American-style universities here, both American University of Kurdistan and American University of Iraq Suleimani, they absolutely both work to promote the idea of volunteerism among their students. And the students can choose sort of the sector that they want to work in, but I don't see any reason why students at these universities wouldn't be able to work on climate activism. In the United States, part of, and this is not unique to the United States, but in the United States, even at the kindergarten through high school level, we have this idea of education for citizenship. So the idea that you're not just teaching people skills, but you're building the citizens of the future.
Exactly.
So people who need to understand their democracy and where their democracy came from, and the fact that people had to fight and die for that democracy, and that ultimately every generation has to fight to keep its democracy. Democracy is a gift from one generation to the next, and it's the responsibility of that next generation to maintain it. Because if it's not maintained and cared for, just like a plant, it's going to die.
Yeah.
So I think it's been Unfortunately, due to budget cuts, some of that has really fallen by the wayside, even in the United States. There's been much more of a focus just on the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, math, and a course that we would have called civics, which is essentially that teaching you how to be a good citizen. That is less and less available in our schools now, which I think is unfortunate. But the core of it still remains the idea that we should be teaching our students how to be future voters and future citizens. You know, I'm not sure, I couldn't speak to what other countries have that idea. I've lived in France long enough to know that they definitely have that, that teaching people how to be French is a part of their education system. You know, it's definitely something that they see as a national responsibility of the education system, just as we do in the United States. I can't speak to that for other countries. I'm just not aware of their systems as well.
Right. Before we finish off, can I ask you, what are specific things that made you want to stay here for longer than a year?
Yeah. The Kurdish people.
Right.
Just very friendly, welcoming, uniquely pro-United States within a region where many of the Iraqi Kurds' neighbors are less friendly to the United States. I mean, that makes such a big difference. The ability to have people who want to work with you and are eager to partner with you makes it possible for us to do so much more. If we were working in a country or a different part of this country where people were less friendly to us, we would just be able to accomplish less. So I think selfishly, you know, I always want to be able to go to a job and see the results of my actions. And this is a place where I can really make a big difference. My Kurdish staff who I work with, who were the same staff who were here 5-6 years ago when I was here, are the best people I've ever met. I love them. They are amazing. They are happy to come to work every day, hardworking, brilliant, inspiring people. And I was just thrilled for the opportunity to come back. So I lobbied actually very hard to be able to come back and work with this same team because I miss them so much. So that's ultimately the biggest reason that I came back.
Wonderful to hear. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
I hope to see you again soon.
You too. It's a pleasure. Happy to come back anytime.
Thank you so much.
Definitely.